The vanishing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her radio headset for the third time in 10 minutes. Static filled her ears, mixing with the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching the landing zone. Her team of 6 soldiers crouched behind rocky outcrops, watching the valleys below for any sign of movement. Sarah had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, leading reconnaissance missions in some of the most dangerous territories. At 28, she was one of the youngest female captains in her division, earning respect through countless successful operations. Her team trusted her completely, following her lead through treacherous mountain passes and hostile villages where every shadow could hide an enemy. The mission seemed routine at first. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was hiding in a remote village 3 kilometers from their position. Sarah's team was tasked with gathering information and calling in coordinates for a larger operation. They had done similar missions dozens of times before, moving like ghosts through enemy territory and returning safely to base. As they descended into the valley, Sarah noticed something felt different. The usual sounds of village life were absent. No children playing, no animals moving, no smoke rising from cooking fires. The silence made her skin crawl, but they pressed forward, following the narrow path that wound between ancient stone buildings. Sergeant Martinez, her second in command, moved beside her with practiced silence. He had served with Sarah for 2 years and could read her expressions like a book. When she raised her fist to signal a halt, he immediately scanned the rooftops for potential threats. The rest of the team spread out in a defensive formation, each soldier covering a different angle. Sarah pulled out her binoculars and studied the village ahead. Something was definitely wrong. The buildings looked empty, but fresh tire tracks in the dirt suggested recent activity. She made hand signals to her team, indicating they should proceed with extreme caution. They moved forward in pairs, using the walls and doorways for cover. The attack came without warning. One moment Sarah was checking her radio connection with base camp, the next moment explosions erupted around them. The sound was deafening, echoing off the mountain walls as dirt and debris filled the air. Enemy fighters appeared from hidden positions in the buildings, their weapons firing rapidly at the exposed soldiers. Sarah's training took over immediately. She rolled behind a low stone wall, her rifle ready as she searched for targets. Through the chaos, she could see her team members taking cover and returning fire. Martinez was shouting coordinates into his radio, trying to call for backup support. The sound of gunfire was constant, punctuated by the whistle of incoming grenades. The firefight lasted for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah's team was outnumbered, but their superior training and equipment gave them an advantage. They managed to eliminate several enemy positions while slowly fighting their way toward higher ground where they could establish better defensive positions. During a brief lull in the shooting, Sarah made a crucial decision. She spotted a group of enemy fighters moving to flank their position from the east. If they succeeded, her entire team would be trapped with no escape route. Without hesitation, she grabbed extra ammunition and prepared to move. She shouted to Martinez over the noise of gunfire, telling him to lead the team to the extraction point 2 kilometers north. She would provide covering fire and hold off the flanking maneuver long enough for them to reach safety. Martinez protested, knowing the extreme danger of her plan, but Sarah's orders were clear and non-negotiable. Sarah sprinted across open ground under heavy fire, diving behind a cluster of boulders that offered a clear view of the approaching enemy fighters. Her rifle cracked repeatedly as she picked off targets with deadly accuracy. The enemy advance slowed, then stopped as they realized they were under attack from an unexpected direction. For 15 minutes, Sarah single-handedly held the enemy position. Her ammunition ran low, but she continued firing controlled bursts, making every shot count. Through her radio, she could hear Martinez reporting that the team was moving toward safety. The sound of approaching helicopters gave her hope that rescue was coming. Then disaster struck. A mortar round exploded just meters from Sarah's position, the blast throwing her against the rocks. Her radio was destroyed, her rifle damaged, and blood flowed from a deep gash on her forehead. Dazed and disoriented, she tried to stand, but her left leg wouldn't support her weight. Enemy voices grew closer as fighters moved in to investigate the explosion site. Sarah dragged herself deeper into the rocks, using her sidearm to cover her retreat. She could hear helicopters overhead, but without her radio, she had no way to signal her location. The The sound of gunfire faded as her team and the rescue helicopters moved away from the area. Hours passed as Sarah remained hidden among the rocks, fighting pain and exhaustion. Night fell quickly in the mountains, bringing cold temperatures and complete darkness. She could hear enemy patrols searching the area, their flashlights sweeping back and forth as they looked for survivors from the battle. Sarah knew she had to move. Staying in one place meant certain capture or death. Despite her injured leg, she began crawling away from the battle site, following a small stream that would mask her tracks. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she forced herself to continue. By dawn, she had traveled less than a kilometer, but she was far enough from the village to feel relatively safe. Her water was running low, and she had no food beyond a few energy bars in her pack. Her injured leg was swollen and infected, making movement increasingly difficult. For 3 days, Sarah survived in the wilderness, drinking from streams and eating wild berries she recognized from survival training. She avoided all human contact, hiding during the day and moving only at night. The mountains were full of enemy patrols searching for her, forcing her to take long detours that sapped her remaining strength. On the 4th day, Sarah's condition worsened dramatically. Infection from her leg wound was spreading, causing fever and delirium. She could barely walk, stumbling through rocky terrain as she tried to reach areas controlled by friendly forces. Her military training warred with her failing body as she pushed herself beyond normal human limits. Meanwhile, at the forward operating base, her commanding officers had made the difficult decision to list Captain Sarah Mitchell as missing in action, presumed dead. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of her after extensive aerial reconnaissance of the battle area. Her personal effects were gathered and prepared for shipment home to her family. Martinez blamed himself for leaving her behind, even though he had followed direct orders. He volunteered for every patrol that entered the area where Sarah had last been seen, hopping against hope to find some sign of her survival. The other team members shared his guilt and determination, refusing to believe their captain was truly gone. Sarah's disappearance made headlines back home, where her family struggled to accept the devastating news. Her younger sister Emma refused to believe Sarah was dead, maintaining that her tough-as-nails sister would find a way to survive anything the mountains could throw at her. Their parents held onto hope while preparing for the worst possible outcome. As days turned into weeks, the official search was called off. The military moved on to other operations, and Sarah Mitchell became another name on the list of heroes who had paid the ultimate price for their country's freedom. Her story seemed to be over, another tragedy of war in a distant land. But Sarah was still alive, moving through hostile territory with nothing but determination and survival instincts. She had no idea that her own military considered her dead, or that her family was grieving her loss. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, keep fighting, and find a way home against impossible odds, the journey of survival. 3 weeks had passed since the firefight that separated Sarah from her team. The infection in her leg had nearly killed her twice, but somehow she had fought through the fever and delirium. Now, moving slowly through a dense forest on the eastern slope of the mountains, she was a shadow of her former self. Her uniform was torn and stained, her face gaunt from hunger, but her eyes still held the fierce determination that had carried her this far. Sarah had learned to live like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without leaving traces. She moved only at night, sleeping during daylight hours in carefully chosen hiding spots among rocks or thick vegetation. Her military training had taught her to navigate by the stars, and she was slowly making her way toward areas she knew were controlled by coalition forces. The first village she encountered after leaving the battle site had been a test of her survival skills. Watching from a hilltop for hours, she observed the daily routines of the inhabitants. Old men tended small gardens while women carried water from a central well. Children played in the dusty streets, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. Most importantly, she saw no signs of armed fighters or military activity. When darkness fell, Sarah crept into the village like a shadow. Her target was a small garden behind one of the houses, where she had spotted vegetables growing in neat rows. Moving silently between the buildings, she gathered what she could carry without being detected. Tomatoes, carrots, and some leafy greens went into her pack, along with water from the well drawn as quietly as possible. As she prepared to leave, Sarah heard voices approaching. A family was returning home late from visiting relatives in a neighboring village. She pressed herself against a wall, barely breathing as the group passed within meters of her hiding spot. A small child lagged behind the adults, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought the boy had seen her. But he simply hurried to catch up with his family, and the street fell silent again. That encounter reminded Sarah of how precarious her situation remained. These people were not her enemies, but they lived under the control of those who were. If she was discovered, they might turn her in out of fear for their own safety. She could not blame them for such a choice, which made her isolation even more complete. Days blended together as Sarah continued her journey. She developed a routine that maximized her chances of survival while minimizing the risk of detection. Before dawn, she would find a hiding place for the day, usually among rocks or in thick undergrowth where she could observe the surrounding area without being seen. During daylight hours, she would rest, tend to her wounds, and plan her route for the following night. Her injured leg remained a constant challenge. The infection had receded, but the limb was weak and painful. Sarah fashioned a crude walking stick from a sturdy branch, which helped her maintain better balance on the rocky terrain. She knew the injury would slow her down, but she had no choice except to adapt and persevere. Water was her most critical need. The mountain streams provided fresh drinking water, but they also presented dangers. Enemy patrols often followed these same waterways, and Sarah had to be extremely careful when approaching them. She developed a system of observing each water source for at least an hour before approaching, watching for any signs of human activity. Food remained scarce, forcing Sarah to rely on her survival training more than she had ever expected. She identified edible plants and berries, caught small fish from streams using improvised traps, and once managed to snare a rabbit that provided protein for several days. Every calorie was precious, and she rationed her finds carefully to maintain her strength for the long journey ahead. The psychological challenges were as difficult as the physical ones. Sarah fought constant battles against despair and hopelessness. During the long hours of hiding, her mind would drift to thoughts of her family and teammates. She wondered if they believed she was dead and whether anyone was still looking for her. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but she channeled those emotions into determination to prove she was still alive. One night, while moving through a narrow valley, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopters in the distance. Her heart raced as she realized they might be search and rescue aircraft looking for her. She climbed to higher ground, searching the sky for navigation lights, but the aircraft were too far away to signal effectively. The sound faded into the distance, leaving her alone again in the darkness. That near miss with potential rescue motivated Sarah to take greater risks in her efforts to reach friendly territory. She began moving during daylight hours when necessary, using terrain features to mask her movement from potential observers. Her progress increased, but so did the danger of detection by enemy forces. During her 4th week in the wilderness, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. The valley she had been following ended at a heavily traveled road that connected several enemy-controlled villages. Military vehicles used this route regularly, making it extremely dangerous to cross. She spent 2 days observing the traffic patterns, looking for a safe window to attempt the crossing. The opportunity came during a fierce thunderstorm that reduced visibility to just a few meters. Sarah waited until the rain was at its heaviest, then sprinted across the open ground as quickly as her injured leg would allow. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, terrifying flashes, but she made it to the other side without being detected. Beyond the road, the terrain became even more challenging. Sarah found herself climbing through high mountain passes where the thin air made every step an effort. The cold was bitter at night, and she had to be careful to avoid hypothermia. Her torn uniform provided little protection against the elements, forcing her to seek shelter in caves or rocky overhangs whenever possible. Food became increasingly scarce in the high mountains. The vegetation was sparse, and wildlife was limited to a few hardy species that Sarah found difficult to catch. She was forced to ration her remaining energy bars even more strictly, eating just enough to maintain basic function. Her body weight dropped dramatically, but she pushed forward with grim determination. During one particularly difficult climb, Sarah encountered a group of local shepherds with their flock. From her hidden position, she watched them navigate paths she had not even noticed. These people knew the mountains intimately, moving with confidence through terrain that challenged her every step. She realized that following their traditional routes might be safer and more efficient than blazing her own trail. That night, Sarah began following the shepherds' paths, staying far behind their last known position. The ancient trails were worn smooth by generations of use, making travel easier despite her injured leg. More importantly, these paths led away from areas where military patrols were likely to operate. The strategy proved successful for several days. Sarah made better progress while expending less energy, and she discovered water sources and shelter sites that the shepherds used regularly. But she also realized that following these routes increased her chances of encountering other people, which could be either salvation or disaster depending on their loyalties. Her caution proved justified when she discovered a shepherd's shelter occupied by armed fighters. Sarah had approached the small stone building hoping to find supplies or better shelter for the night. Instead, she found herself watching enemy soldiers who had commandeered the structure for their own use. She retreated carefully, but the encounter reminded her that danger lurked everywhere in this landscape. As her 5th week of survival began, Sarah noticed changes in the terrain that suggested she was finally approaching areas under coalition control. The villages looked different, with fewer weapons visible and more normal civilian activity. Aircraft overhead seemed to be flying different patterns, possibly indicating friendly air operations in the area. But Sarah also realized that her appearance had changed dramatically during her ordeal. She was gaunt and dirty, her uniform torn and unrecognizable. If she encountered coalition forces, would they recognize her as a friendly soldier, or would they see her as a potential threat? She began planning how to approach friendly forces safely, knowing that her survival depended on making the right choices in those crucial first moments of contact. The isolation was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. Sarah had always been strong and independent, but humans were not meant to live in complete solitude for extended periods. She found herself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was her own. Sometimes she would recite military protocols or procedures, using the familiar words to maintain her connection to her identity as a soldier. Despite all the challenges, Sarah refused to give up hope. She had survived this long against impossible odds, and she was determined to complete her journey home. Every night brought her closer to safety, closer to reunion with her team and family. She carried their faces in her memory like precious treasures, drawing strength from the knowledge that they would be waiting for her return. The return from the 6 weeks after disappearing behind enemy lines, Sarah Mitchell stood on a rocky ridge overlooking what appeared to be a coalition forward operating base. The sight of familiar military vehicles and equipment filled her with emotion so intense she had to sit down to steady herself. American flags flew above concrete barriers, and she could see soldiers moving with the efficient purpose she remembered from her own service. But Sarah hesitated to approach immediately. Her reflection in a stream that morning had shown her a stranger with hollow cheeks, tangled hair, and haunted eyes. Her uniform was barely recognizable, torn and patched with pieces of cloth scavenged during her journey. She looked more like a refugee than a United States Army captain, and she knew that approaching the base without proper identification could result in her being shot as a potential threat. During her long weeks in the wilderness, Sarah had lost her dog tags, identification card, and all other military documentation. Even her weapon serial numbers, which she had memorized according to regulations, would be meaningless without supporting identification. She needed to approach the base in a way that would convince the guards she was a legitimate American soldier rather than an enemy infiltrator. As evening approached, Sarah made her decision. She would approach the main gate during daylight hours when visibility was best and multiple guards would be present to assess the situation. She spent the night rehearsing what she would say, practicing the specific military procedures and protocols that would prove her identity to suspicious guards. At dawn, Sarah began her final descent toward the base. Her injured leg, which had improved somewhat during the journey, still caused her to walk with a noticeable limp. She moved slowly and deliberately, keeping her hands visible at all times to avoid any appearance of hostile intent. When she was still several hundred meters from the outer perimeter, guards spotted her through their binoculars. The reaction was immediate and intense. Sirens began wailing as soldiers took defensive positions behind concrete barriers and sandbags. Sarah could see rifle barrels pointed in her direction as voices shouted commands she could not quite understand at this distance. She stopped walking and raised her hands above her head, showing that she carried no weapons. A loudspeaker crackled to life, the amplified voice carrying clearly across the open ground between Sarah and the base perimeter. The commands were in English, demanding that she identify herself and state her purpose for approaching the facility. Sarah took a deep breath and shouted back, giving her name, rank, serial number, and unit designation. The response from the base was immediate confusion. Sarah could see soldiers talking rapidly among themselves, some pointing in her direction while others worked radio equipment frantically. She remained motionless with her hands raised, understanding that this moment was critical. One wrong move could result in tragedy for everyone involved. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, a small group of soldiers emerged from the base perimeter. They moved cautiously toward Sarah, their weapons ready but not directly aimed at her. The lead soldier, a lieutenant she did not recognize, approached to within speaking distance while his team provided cover from multiple angles. The lieutenant's first questions were basic but crucial. He asked for Sarah's full name, rank, and unit, then followed up with questions only a real American soldier would know. Her commanding officer's name, the designation of her forward operating base, and details about recent operations in the area. Sarah answered each question accurately, despite her exhaustion and emotional state. But the lieutenant remained skeptical. According to his information, Captain Sarah Mitchell had been killed in action more than a month ago. Her unit had reported her missing and presumed dead after an enemy engagement, and no subsequent intelligence suggested she might have survived. From his perspective, this dirty and emaciated woman claiming to be a dead officer was most likely an enemy agent attempting to infiltrate the base. Sarah realized she needed to provide information that only she could know. She began reciting details about her team members, including personal information that would not appear in any official records. Martinez's habit of humming old rock songs during long marches. The photograph of his daughter that he kept taped to the inside of his helmet. Private Johnson's fear of spiders, which had caused problems during one memorable patrol through caves. The specificity of these details began to convince the lieutenant that Sarah might be telling the truth. He contacted his commanding officer via radio, explaining the unusual situation and requesting immediate assistance. While they waited for additional personnel to arrive, Sarah was allowed to sit on the ground but remained under guard. Within an hour, a convoy of vehicles arrived from the main base, carrying officers who had known Sarah personally before her disappearance. Among them was Major, who had briefed her for the fatal mission weeks earlier. When he saw Sarah, his professional composure cracked for just a moment before military discipline reasserted itself. The reunion was emotional but cautious. Major had to balance his joy at finding Sarah alive with the security protocols that governed such situations. Until her identity could be completely and she could be debriefed about her experiences, she would have to be treated as a potential security risk. Sarah was transported to the base hospital, where medical personnel began treating her various injuries and assessing her overall condition. She had lost nearly 30 pounds during her ordeal, and her injured leg required immediate attention. Dehydration and malnutrition had taken a severe toll on her body, but the doctors were amazed by her overall condition considering what she had endured. During her medical evaluation, intelligence officers began the process of debriefing Sarah about her experiences behind enemy lines. Every detail of her journey was important, from the locations of enemy positions to the routes she had used to avoid detection. Her information would be invaluable for future operations in the same area. The debriefing process was thorough but gentle, recognizing that Sarah had been through extreme trauma. She recounted her experiences chronologically, starting with the ambush that had separated her from her team and ending with her approach to the base that morning. Intelligence analysts took careful notes, already planning how to use her information to improve operational security for future missions. News of Sarah's survival spread quickly through military channels. Her family, who had been grieving her death for weeks, received an unexpected phone call informing them that she was alive and safe. The emotional impact was overwhelming, as they struggled to process the transition from grief to joy in the span of a single conversation. Martinez and the surviving members of Sarah's original team were flown to the base as soon as possible. The reunion was intense and emotional, with hardened soldiers openly weeping as they embraced their captain who had returned from the dead. Martinez blamed himself for leaving her behind, but Sarah assured him that he had followed orders and done exactly what was necessary to save the rest of the team. The media attention was immediate and intense once news of Sarah's survival became public. Her story of surviving alone behind enemy lines for 6 weeks captured public imagination, and she became a symbol of American military resilience and determination. Interview requests flooded in from news organizations around the world, all wanting to hear her story directly. But Sarah was not ready for public attention. The psychological impact of her ordeal was still being processed, and military psychologists recommended a gradual reintegration process. She would need time to heal physically and mentally before facing the demands of media appearances and public speaking engagements. During her recovery, Sarah learned about the extensive search and rescue operations that had been conducted after her disappearance. Aircraft had flown hundreds of hours looking for signs of her survival, and ground teams had risked their lives searching enemy territory for any trace of her presence. The fact that these efforts had failed was not due to lack of trying, but rather a testament to Sarah's skill at remaining hidden. Her commanding officers recommended Sarah for several military decorations, recognizing both her actions during the original firefight and her extraordinary survival journey. The Silver Star was approved for her heroism in holding off enemy forces while her team escaped, and a Purple Heart recognized the wounds she had sustained in combat. 3 months after her return, Sarah was medically cleared for limited duty and began the process of deciding her future in the military. Her experiences had changed her profoundly, giving her perspectives that few soldiers ever acquire. Some days she felt stronger than ever, proud of what she had accomplished under impossible circumstances. Other days, the memories of isolation and near-death experiences overwhelmed her with their intensity. Sarah chose to remain in the military, but in a different capacity. Her survival experience and intimate knowledge of enemy territory made her valuable as an instructor and consultant for special operations training. She could teach other soldiers the skills they might need if they ever found themselves in similar circumstances. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell became a legend within military circles, inspiring countless soldiers with its demonstration that survival is possible even under the most dire circumstances. Her journey from presumed dead to walking back into base on her own feet represented the best qualities of military service: courage, determination, and an unbreakable will to return home. But for Sarah herself, the most important moment was not the medals or recognition that followed. It was the simple act of walking through the gate of an American military base and hearing her own language spoken by people who understood who she was and where she belonged. After 6 weeks of living like a ghost in hostile territory, she had finally come home.